All right, welcome everybody to our monthly SciEngage discussion. My name is Jeff Hunt. I'm the director of LabX at the National Academy of Sciences. I co-host this with the AAAS Center for Public Engagement, represented by, I see several names on there, but most prominently Alana Kimbrell, joining us from California. So just so everybody knows, this is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. And I like these because I just get to give the introduction and then hand it over to our presenters for today. So we'll be hearing about the AAAS program on dialogue with science, ethics, and religion. And we have Rob O'Malley and John Slattery who are going to take us through that. So they're going to give a little bit of a presentation, and then as always, we'll open it up for questions. Please just keep yourself on mute until we get to the questions part. And with that, Rob, John, take it away.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. We're not muted. Okay. So as Jeff said, I'm Rob O'Malley. My colleague John Slattery and I are here from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program, sometimes called DOSER. As Jeff said, I think the plan will be we'll talk a little bit about some of our active projects, what we do, and then open it up for questions. And discussion, and we're really looking forward, I think, to getting some feedback and some questions about sort of what we do and how that fits into the broader science engagement landscape. So let me go ahead and share our screen here. So you did this, right?
Yeah.
Share. Okay, so DOSER has been around for about 25 years, and the central mission of our program, as part of AAAS's broader effort to advance science and serve society, is to facilitate communication and engagement between scientific and religious communities. Based on, for example, recent Pew survey data, about 3/4 of the US public self-identifies as religious. What it means to be religious can be very complicated. We can talk about that. But 3/4 of the US public self-identify as having some religious affiliation. So most publics, or most public engagement activities, are probably going to be including members of faith communities or people who have some affiliation with faith communities. And of course, scientific and religious communities do overlap. There's some data, and this again is complicated, social science data is complicated, but there's some data suggesting, for example, that about 30% of PhD physicists and biologists claim some religious identity or claim religious affiliation. So these are overlapping categories. Very central to the work that our program does is the idea that science occurs in a cultural and a social context. It doesn't just exist in a vacuum by itself. And if we want to be true to sort of the idea that science is for the benefit of people, and that science should be engaged with and responsive to the needs and concerns of society, this element of society is in fact really central to a lot of the cultural fabric of the United States, a lot of individual and personal identity. And so scientists, whatever their own personal persuasion, I think really benefit from being very thoughtful about how they think about science in that cultural context, how they talk about science, and who gets to participate in science discourse. Our central website is here if you want to kind of learn more about our programs. But we're just going to highlight a couple of things that we do here today, and then we can talk about other things as questions come up. So what do we do? Well, some of the things that we do include hosting basically models for what dialogue between scientists and society, in particular members of faith communities or representatives of faith communities, what that dialogue can look like. So this can include annual meeting symposia at the AAAS annual meeting. These are all online and recorded. You can check them out on our website. These are some of the ones we've hosted in the last 2 years. For example, for the gene editing and human identity session, we hosted Father Nick Austriaco, who was both a Catholic priest and also an MIT-trained geneticist, talking about faith community perspectives on gene editing. We also had scientists talking about the actual work of working with CRISPR-Cas9. and other gene editing technologies. We had a bioethicist, and we also had a skeptic talking about kind of raising concerns about how these technologies can be leveraged, and in some cases might be harmful to many communities that are going to be impacted by these new technologies. This coming year, we have at the 2020 annual meeting, we have a session on faith community responses to climate change, and then another one on death in the 21st century that will explore what happens to your Google profile after death, like all your electronic resources, what happens to your medical records and your genetic information after death, and also environmental impacts of burial practices and sustainable alternatives. And again, the idea is to sort of model what does it look like when scientists are in dialogue with other segments of society talking about these science issues. We also host a holiday lecture each year, again, spanning a whole range of science topics. Last year's we talked about genetic diversity, history, and cultural identity, hosting a geneticist, a cultural anthropologist, and a theologian, exploring different elements of identity and genetics and how those apply in different, can be understood in different contexts and in different communities. Our session this year, we're very pleased to be hosting Dr. Catherine Hayhoe from Texas Tech University. And the respondent will be the former bishop, presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Dr. Catherine Jeffords Shorey, who is herself an oceanographer by training. So if you're in DC and you're going to be around on December 17th, you're very welcome to attend. We have a very nice reception to follow afterwards. But if you can't attend in person, it's also going to be live streamed and recorded, so you can check it out. So one of the two projects we have active right now is spearheaded by myself, and then John will talk about our other major project. The project that I spearhead is called Engaging Scientists in the Science and Religion Dialogue, which has as its focus an effort to support scientists, educators, and science communicators in more inclusive public engagement activities, whether that's in classrooms, whether that's in sort of more general public engagement contexts, to just be more thoughtful in how they, even people I think who are very thoughtful about using best practices in science engagement and who seek to be inclusive in presenting their science content or the kind of ways they talk about science. Often faith and spirituality as a key element of culture and as personal identity doesn't often receive a lot of attention. And so we're encouraging people who are doing science engagement to really be aware of that and to draw on evidence-based practices and what the research says about what is effective in science communication in that domain. So as part of that project, we've hosted a great many events, including contributions to meeting programming, hosted symposia, roundtables, as well as workshops at a number of science society meetings over the last few years. We've also hosted events at universities, and we've done a couple of workshops at informal science learning venues, so science museums, natural history museums. As part of that project, we've also awarded $18,000 in $1,000 awards to attendees at our workshops who are willing to go on and then work in some kind of, develop some kind of public engagement project that is inclusive of or explicitly focused on engagement with faith communities. We've also produced a booklet, which it can be found on our website. It's a lovely little booklet right here. You can download it for free. That's basically an overview of what the research suggests about what can be effective in science communication with a focus on dialogue. And that will be joined by a second companion booklet, hopefully early in 2020, that is focused explicitly on engagement with faith communities, drawing on a lot of perspectives and insights from researchers at different career stages, in different contexts, and different science fields. Over the next year, we're also looking to become a resource hub for faith community engagement and highlighting video resources, some elements of our workshop, and additional print resources. So you can keep an eye out for that in the coming months. In terms of measuring impact, we are definitely believers in seeing if what we are doing is having any impact at all. So that's an important element, I think, of science communication. In the Engaging Scientists workshop thus far, we've had about 520 attendees. And we do pre and post workshop surveys of these attendees to sort of assess, was this relevant, was this helpful? And I'm just pulling out a couple of highlights here. For questions such as, how skilled do you feel about engaging with religious audiences about science topics, or responding to comments or questions about science that are informed by faith beliefs, we do see, I think, pretty robust shifts in people's comfort level in doing this kind of work. And I want to emphasize, a lot of what we talk about in these workshops is not, it's not rocket science. It's really drawing on best practices in science communication, that, storytelling, bringing more of yourself into the, into the conversation, showing empathy, listening, meeting people where they are, trying to identify areas of common ground and common interests. But again, sometimes scientists and science communicators have appreciated highlighting this particular element of identity in thinking about how to do science communication effectively. So some of the more qualitative responses we've gotten about our workshops, they provided opportunities for thoughtful consideration of culture and faith. So for example, one attendee shared, understanding the nuances about culture and religion that may affect how they respond to science and scientists was something I had not heard before. Another noted, I really like the handling of several different faiths rather than focusing on the most common faith in the US. I like the emphasis on the difference between being a practicing and a cultural religious person. Sometimes I forget how much I am shaped by the Christian faith, despite not being Christian myself. It provides a safe space to discuss sensitive topics. As noted earlier, scientific and religious communities do overlap. And something that comes up a lot in our workshops is scientists of faith talking about not feeling welcome in science spaces. And as we think about trying to build a more inclusive practice of science and more inclusive discourse about science in public arenas, it's worth reflecting on, what signals scientists send about who gets to participate in these discussions and who's welcome in calling themselves a scientist. So that's been something that's come up again and again. And then finally, helping attendees think about how they can put things into practice. In assessing the impacts of our workshop, what we find is that attendees are not typically leading our workshop and then going out and starting to knock on synagogue doors or church doors to do direct engagement with faith communities. What they do tend to do is immediately start incorporating this into things that they're already doing. The kinds of language they use, the kind of examples that they use, or in some cases, like how they recruit and train volunteer staff, which is great, which is all great outcomes. And I think is a good way to sort of integrate the kind of content we're sharing with what people are already doing. We do have 2 upcoming workshops at the AGU meeting on Tuesday, December 10th, and then in January at the American Astronomical Society meeting in Honolulu. These are, you're very welcome to attend if you're going to be attending either of these. And there may be other opportunities in the coming months in the DC area, so please stay alert for that. So I'm going to hand it over now to John to talk about our other major project, and then we can open it up to broader discussion.
Great, awesome, thanks, Rob. So on the other side of Dozer, we work directly with religious communities. So one of the projects that I manage is called Science for Seminaries, and this project has been around since about 2014 in different iterations. And the main point of this project is, how do we help religious communities become more comfortable with science? And you can all, I am sure, imagine what are the flashpoints for the major religious communities that get talked about on a regular basis. You have evolution, you have climate change, you have a whole bunch of other stuff in between. And one of the goals of this project was to say, okay, let's get into the place where future pastors are being trained, so go into the seminaries themselves. Then let's open it up to just talk about science, period. And not force the schools to talk about the really difficult issues, but with the idea that if a school can like if a conservative Baptist seminary, which is one of the ones we're working with right now, can talk about science and talk about contemporary good science and bring this into one of their classes, this opens the door. It opens the door for, if you're defining something as really good science, and that's going to open the door for other engagement with good science and for the idea of science not to be one that is always controversial, but to be one that is good and positive and really helpful in their own pedagogical discussion. So myself, I have a seminary background, and then I have a PhD in this, in the history of science, but in a focus on this theology and science conversation. And so I have a lot of comfort level in talking to these seminary professors all over the US and Canada. So right now, we're working with 16 seminaries concurrently. We have 4 cohorts of seminaries, they each get $75,000 grants, and these are 18-month grants. And so some of them are ending this month, some of them will end next October, and then we're actually in the midst of choosing our next set of seminaries, which will then go through 2021, and then we'll do one more after that as well. And one of the major things that we like about it, and I think the AAAS brings to this project, is connecting seminaries with local scientists. One of the biggest things in the religious, and at least especially the academic theological world, is to deal with science as an idea, and science as sort of a collection of theories. And so similar to what Rob was saying, right? The basic sort of notions of what science engagement should be, what science communication should be, is connecting these seminary professors to actual scientists that are involved in actual research. And it really helps to break down a lot of those ideological barriers and helps the seminary professors, and then hopefully the seminarians as well, see the science as something that's connected to real, tangible people. And this helps to have really good conversations about it. So in the midst of this, you see some pictures here. We also take the seminary leaders on a couple of field trips here in the DC area, as well as have a summer workshop every year, which is a 3-day-long workshop. And then on top of all of that, the grant that we're currently on also has funding to do a film series, which is really fantastic and a whole other conversation about science engagement, and that we're currently filming sort of the second chunk of those. But you can see the current ones at scienceforseminaries.org. So a couple of things about the schools. You can see the current, that chart really shows all the schools that we've worked with over the last, whoa, that one, that's so funny. Oh, it's animated. Sorry. Automatic transition, that was funny. That's okay. So all the schools that we've worked with over the last couple of years, and then this is just a number of stuff. So each of the schools, it's okay, it's for me to move on quickly. Each of the schools has to do 2 courses and 1 campus event, and they all do more than that. Sorry about that, there we go. So over the last, the first phase of the project was 110 courses affected and 70 campus events. And then this one, we've already had over 30 events and 25 courses. And we keep a survey of how many students are taking the courses. So since 2018, we've already had over 1,000 students in seminaries around the US and Canada taking these science-affected courses. So it's a really interesting project with a lot of different parts, a lot of different moving pieces. We just had a really big event at the American Academy of Religion annual meeting, which is about a 10,000 person meeting in San Diego, California. And we actually went to the Scripps Oceanography Institute and had some fantastic speakers there, and then hosted a really big reception with a bunch of other religion and science groups that are largely focused on religious communities. And so these are just a couple of quotes from the different people that have worked with us. And it's really been, for a lot of schools, it's really been a wonderful experience to see how the different professors and the students can really engage with science and how much this helps their own pedagogy. It's sort of a win-win situation for them, similar to how it is working with museums and other universities, is that if they do this well, it actually helps their own programs as well as helps us to help them engage with science. So it's one of my favorite parts about it, is talking to people after the fact and seeing how much everything was really assisted. Even though in this big span of the university, it's a pretty small $75,000 grant, but it can go a long way in helping to jumpstart the conversations on campus. Yeah. Okay.
So some things to think about that can maybe inform how we start talking back and forth now for the remainder of the time would be we are really interested to hear about if and how faith communities, or even just a consideration of this element of personal identity, which is quite common for many people. Is this already part of your science engagement activities? Is this something you already think about? Because we have learned that many people are, in fact, already active in this space independently and have a lot of insight to share. And we like highlighting that where we can. And also something that's really helpful for us is to hear from those of you who are doing public engagement, who are involved in it, what kind of resources you would like to see that would help in this domain in supporting more constructive or more effective or more scalable public engagement activities, because that is a place that we really want to be as part of AAAS, given our focus. I also just wanted to note, we do have a couple of people on the call who have either been presenters or participants in other elements of the project, and so I certainly would welcome their sharing any thoughts they had about what it was like to be a presenter or to see the workshop, or otherwise chime in. I just wanted to close with just noting here's our contact information. If you have any questions afterwards, you can follow us on Twitter individually or as a program. And you can learn more about what we're doing now and in the future from our mailing list and online. So please, we encourage you to do that. So
yeah, that's good.
Okay. So
should we stop?
Yeah. So why don't we go ahead and stop sharing? You can look at us.
Right. Come back.
So thoughts.
That's good.
Well, I'd love to hear from it, like you said, if there's anybody on the call who's participated in any of the DOSER programs. If you were able to chime in, that'd be great. We'd love to hear from you.
So in particular, Dr. Caitlin Schein has presented our event at UMBC, and we had invited her to share any thoughts she might have. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Okay, so yes, I did participate in an Engaging Scientists event at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which I thought was really rewarding as a presenter, and I think equally rewarding for the audience members. But I did get to observe the Engaging Scientists workshop. I didn't participate, so I wasn't sitting at an individual table working with a group, but I got to walk around a little bit, hear what people were talking about. And I think what's really fantastic about the workshop, and Rob, you touched on this a little bit, is that it really is about best practices for science communication that could be applied no matter what your engagement activity is. So I think that the workshop helps develop an approach, essentially a project management approach to creating science engagement activities. So as someone who project manages communications campaigns, when I looked at the workshop handout, I recognized that these are the exact same steps that I go through: identifying audience, figuring out what the audience's needs are, the goals of the project, what exactly you want the audience to take away, and then the evaluation and things like that. So I think for the participants in that particular workshop, who I think, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, but it included everything from undergraduates to faculty, right?
Yeah, the workshops are typically geared towards graduate students and above, but we never turn people away. So sometimes there's undergraduates who attend, and that was the case.
Okay. So I think this is a skill set that, having been through graduate school myself, I never was taught in graduate school how to manage an activity or project in this way, or think strategically about audience. And so obviously as scientists, we give talks all the time to each other, to one another, but I never approached, let's say, a podium presentation at a conference thoughtfully in the way that I think that you help the workshop participants approach an engagement activity regardless of what the audience is. I think they were able to apply the methods and techniques that you were getting them engaged into any project they might have wanted to do. So I thought that was valuable. So I was a panelist in the evening for that event, and I just brought up, just for everyone else on the call, the other panelists were Rabbi Jeff Middleman, who does the Sinai and Synapses project, Dr. Pamela Payne Foster, who I think a number of us have probably heard from at other panels before, and she does preventative medicine work, I think. And then Dr. Sadi?
Yes.
Dr. Altaf Sadi, who's a neurologist and fellow at UCLA, who's involved in healthcare leadership. And then my research was actually on the teaching and learning of human evolution and how that affects public university students thinking about social issues with a scientific basis. So the diversity of the panel was outstanding, in my opinion. I really appreciated not just the diversity of the topics that we were talking about and the perspectives that we had, but the diversity of ways in which we were able to share information with the audience about topics that I think were of varying relevance to the audience's lives. So I think there were probably people in the audience who were really probably really drawn into the conversation by the healthcare related conversations, right? And I think there were some educators there who might have been more interested in a more formal education approach to having conversations with students who have a faith-based background. So I would give you kudos for putting together very thoughtfully, in my opinion, a diverse panel that really addressed different aspects of the types of conversations that we need to be having as scientists and healthcare providers around the issue of science and faith and how that's handled. So
great. So thank you very much for that. I wanted to add something I was remiss in skipping over is that the Engaging Scientists Project is a partnership with the AAAS Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology. So particularly in terms of making sure that we are aligned with best practices, that relies a lot on our existing partnership with this AAAS's Public Engagement Center. So I wanted to make sure that was acknowledged. But thank you very much, Caitlin, for sharing your thoughts. So others chime in on chat or?
This is Larry Rudnick from the University of Minnesota. I've been having conversations in churches semi-regularly now and building up. And one of the things that's come out of that is a university group where the students were talking about a fairly hostile environment in their classes and sometimes in their research labs. And I've been trying to figure out which sort of office in our university would help take responsibility for this. We have lots of diversity work and stuff. And the question is there anybody whose university actually works on this topic with faculty members and students about how to create a respectful environment for students of faith?
That's a great question. My suspicion is that that is not a formal position at most universities. I also suspect that most universities, if you ask them, would say that, my goodness, this is, of course, something that's part of our, efforts to approach science or STEM education in inclusive and thoughtful and equitable ways. But I don't know that there's usually, there'd be like an Office of Religious Life or something, but this particular element of that is maybe not part of university structure. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Not directly. I mean, that's because something like that, I feel like if you were at a religious affiliated institution, it'd be a little different but you said you're at U of M. Yeah, and so I think that, it's really different, and I think it really depends upon whose lab you're in, what kind of conversation. I think probably the best thing, is making sure people are aware. But even that, I know from experience, is a little dicey, because if you make those certain people aware, they may sort of disregard and like, well, that's not our problem to deal with. And so I think it's sort of finding allies in this approach to science engagement and science communication, and getting people on board, and then starting to address some of the issues one by one. But I'm sure with Rob, I don't think I would doubt you had anybody that was, unless you raised it at a level of saying, well, this is a matter of people feeling isolated in the classroom, then you could sort of look at like, vice president of student affairs or something like that, which might be a place to go. But the conversation, because it's a very dicey conversation sometimes, would have to be handled pretty delicately. But I mean, that's maybe a place to start, sort of a general, hey, do you know this is happening with some students with this segment of the population? Do you have any advice on how I could approach those types of things?
I would add something that I think, so our program very explicitly, our role as part of a science organization, we are not weighing in directly on theological matters, right? Our role is to make sure that science is represented well in conversations, that institutions or communities that want to engage with science are finding good content and good scientists who are really willing to engage them in ways that are respectful and useful to them, but also true to what science is and what we understand science to be. So we're striving very hard we're striving very hard to stay in our lane of representing science in this discourse. And I think that even scientists who may not be people of faith themselves, and who may be kind of skeptical of this effort, I think if it's framed as an inclusion issue in terms of, if science is to be for everyone, what steps are we taking to make sure that we are providing that environment, an inclusive, thoughtful environment that lets people bring their whole selves into science spaces to do good science. And I think that very often, even scientists who may be skeptical of the kind of work that we do can get on board with that. Yeah. So I think that that's a framing to maybe think about in terms of making the case internally about why this is something departments or institutions need to be thinking about.
Well, and it's also tricky too, because it could also just be students, right? It could be other students that are being the hostile ones, and I think so. There's a lot of conversations there, but I think Rob is exactly right, saying what is the point of science, and if we can convince people that this aspect of science is a really positive one, I think it pays a lot of dividends. Once people start to realize that, they might realize why these conversations are deleterious towards the overall effect of doing good work and sort of pushing forward in the name of science. So, yeah. Okay, I see another question over here. It's written in. How are seminaries selected to be a part of your program? It's a great question. And it was actually one of the biggest questions when we first started the program back in 2014. So we had a whole big planning period, and one of the things they came up with was having an advisory board that was full of both theologians and religious studies experts that were experts in the field of science and religion, but also with scientists themselves, whether or not they are religiously affiliated. So right now we have 14 people on our advisory board. I think there are 8 theologians and 6 scientists representing a lot of different scientific disciplines. So we have the seminaries are chosen in 2 chunks. They submit sort of letters of interest, and then they submit a full proposal. So, and then in both of those chunks, we send out the applications to sort of a randomly selected group of our advisory board, and then we get back comments. And then in consultation with the Association of Theological Schools, which is the main accreditor of seminaries, and all these reviewers' comments, we end up selecting which seminaries would be best for the grant. And usually that selection rests upon two things. It rests upon what would be the impact of the grant for the seminaries, whether or not they've dealt with religion and science issues before, how is it going to change them, and then whether or not the changes will be sustainable. So sometimes we get applications for seminaries just want to do bring a whole bunch of big speakers to campus or run one really big class or something like this. And we try to lean away from those because the changes aren't going to be changes that will stick in the end. So the main requirement is to take their two of their core seminary classes and put science into them, and other stuff that they do that's related to that is really what we tend to lean towards. But we were really happy with how it's worked so far to have both scientists and religious scholars on our advisory board. And it's really allowed us to get a good balance of opinions in that process.
I would just add, to be eligible to apply for the grant, they do need to be part of the Association for Theological Schools.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of a first step in that they need to be kind of a well-established part of this formal accredited.
Which is nearly every single seminary in the country. I mean, it's not going to include a couple, but those few that it wouldn't include probably wouldn't want to work with us anyway, because they'd be on the very, very, very politically conservative side. And so yeah, they accredit about 275 seminaries across the U.S. and Canada that we work with. And of those, we've had applications from about 115 so far. So pretty good. I think it's a question for you.
Yeah. So another question: best practice in public engagement with science is to engage in a two-way dialogue. What does this imply for the scientists and their openness to accepting the faith-based perspectives of their dialogue partners? So I think that in my experience, what I think everyone appreciates is honesty and humility. I have been really struck in my work in this program over the last 3 years with really kind of addressing some of my own preconceptions about what people thought about science. My background is evolutionary biology and specifically primatology, so primate behavior and ecology, chasing monkeys around in the forest. So I encountered human evolution a lot, like that's one of my real areas of interest and expertise. And one of the things I've really come to appreciate is there's few things more frustrating than being told what you believe by other people. And a much better mode to sort of start having constructive conversations with people that you may not agree with, or maybe you're never going to agree with about some really central ideas about how the world works or the universe works, is to just ask them and to just ask questions. And there's this term that I really like, which is cultural humility, which is basically that, like giving people an opportunity to share what they think about things rather than you as the other person kind of deciding that for them. And just, I think, it's all best practices, right? It's listening, it's being honest, it's giving people a chance to share and feel that they're not going to be, recognizing that there's not necessarily going to be agreement, but that they can share and that that's okay. That's really what's central to it. And in terms of selecting our presenters or advisors to these projects, like that is very much the skill set that we're looking for, because this is sometimes involves some uncomfortable conversations, and we want people to know that going in. And I think it's the success in particularly in seminary schools, I think is really a testament to how effective that approach has been. Maybe you want to add something?
No, that's exactly where we should go. I think Lizzie, Krish had a question here. Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi everyone, my name is Lizzie and I work with Rocky DU. Something I've been working on recently is to try to engage the Orthodox community around New York. There is a serious problem with access that the Jewish community has to science in a lot of the Orthodox private schools. And it's not only an issue with content, but also with the language surrounding it and the people that they're able to identify with. So I've been actually partnering with a graduate student at our institution to try to bring in more students from the Orthodox community into our lab spaces and to show them scientists that they're able to identify with. And to also provide programming on Thursday evenings instead of Friday evenings, and to be culturally sensitive. That being said, there is a lot that needs to be learned about how to communicate with the Orthodox communities, language, the culture, even understanding when they need certain kinds of food and when they can't come to events, and accommodating their needs in that environment in a very intimate way. And so I've been working hard on that to try to understand more what they need, and our team at Rocky DU has been working on that as well. And I was kind of curious what you guys have been doing to try to more deeply understand the needs of the community and to provide access to the Orthodox communities.
So that's a great question. So one of our smaller projects that is sort of modeled as in parallels with the Science for Seminaries is we do have a Scientists in Synagogues program that is actually led by an organization in New York, Sinai and Synapses, and that's run by Jeff Middleman. So that I think would be a place to start. That's not our program. We're sort of advising and a partner on that program. Yeah. But he as a rabbi, I think he is certainly very thoughtful about intersections between science and Judaism in particular, but he also thinks about these things more broadly than that. And I think he is very, Rabbi Middleman is very thoughtful about trying to build networks and build collaborations. He's had a few cohorts of fellows that participate in webinars, much like this one, contribute writings to his blog. So I think that would be a place to start. But maybe you have some other.
No, I mean, I think that's a great place to start. I mean, it sounds like what you're doing is really the best, the best way forward. Like Rob was saying before, I mean, one of the hardest things. So in working with the seminaries, I work with seminaries all the way that are sort of very sort of progressive mainline seminaries who are dealing with science, sociological issues of race and psychology of trauma and lots of things, as well as very conservative seminaries who are still wrestling because most of their seminarians don't, believe in evolution, and a lot of the seminary professors don't either. And so we're at very opposite ends of the spectrum, and it's the same exact program coming at them. And really the approach that we have is that science, if we can all agree that science itself is a public good and that science helps to search for truth, then we can start to have these individual conversations and have the humility that Rob talked about in talking with the people, whatever their religious background is. And, it sounds like what you're doing is exactly that. You're respectful of their own, religious beliefs and how they want to approach life, and then trying to bring science into conversation with that. I think that sounds like a great step forward, and trying to hear from them what is it about aspects of science that are troubling or that are interested in them. What do the people of that community want to learn more about? And then if you get that part, then you can get to the things that you think they need to learn more about. And so it's trying to bridge those two gaps, which is always really tricky, but that's the most important piece. And I think, Jeff would be a great start. And if you don't already know that group, start into some of those conversations. And we'd be happy to keep talking with you about work in the future as well.
I would just add, I think in general, particularly in kind of the early stages of these types of engagement activities, finding representatives within a community you'd like to engage with, who are maybe already scientists or who already have credibility on these issues as the starting point, like that can be really critical, particularly for communities that maybe historically have been harmed by science or have been excluded from science. Being skeptical of outside scientists coming in and wanting to talk about science is a very rational perspective. So finding some members who can kind of help facilitate some initial conversations, who can serve as a mediator between if one is coming in as an outsider in some sense with the community as a whole. That can be really critical. And that's what the evidence suggests is really effective. So
Thank you.
Evidence-based. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's a couple of comments that have been made over here. Some are great suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of setting up a Google group or Slack channel, so this is something we actually, AAAS did have this social network a couple of years ago. Oh, I guess it's still active, Trellis, the Trellis network. And that's still active in some sense, but most of the AAAS sort of public discourse has migrated over to Member Central. I think we would love to find a way to facilitate online discussions about this in a rolling way. And I think that suggestion, which is a great one, is very much in line with what we want to do. The challenge can often be, it's really critical for that space to be like well moderated and well managed.
Everyone knows the challenge.
Yeah,
it's the online space. You know?
It's
hard.
So that's been a little bit of a challenge for us in terms of freeing up enough bandwidth among our various projects to do that. That is part of some projects we have in the pipeline. That we might be able to have, some online spaces that are well moderated, that are not necessarily wide open to the whole public, at least initially. So that would be something to watch for in the future. In the meantime, we are trying to be more thoughtful about two-way engagement in sort of our newsletter contexts, and in at least in the coming year in developing a resource hub. So I would certainly encourage you to join our mailing list, and that maybe can be a route where we can, provide some vehicles for people to share their thoughts or, experiences that they've had, identify some best practices. So it's not just us sending stuff out, but actually getting some input from the community that we can share more broadly. We do have a sign up link for what we call the Engaging Scientists Network, which was part of the Engaging Scientists Project and was a way to sort of collect some information about scientists and also community representatives who were interested in this kind of dialogue. That is still active. That's a great way. If scientists are interested in sort of signaling their interest in doing more stuff, you can basically create a little profile in that. We have not really done much with that network yet, but again, looking ahead for the next year or two, that's something we want to start developing and to sort of, a lot of these, there's a lot of wisdom and insight and experience out there in the world that we want to draw from and signal boost. And so that's what we'd like to do as a program moving forward.
Other comments that jumped up, one of our former colleagues mentioned about maybe sort of adopting sort of a code of conduct for sort of science labs related to faith perspectives. This actually reminds me a lot of the cultural competencies discussion of the people down at ASU, which are talking about, how do we talk about different faith perspectives in a science setting. That's really, really interesting idea. It's not something that we have pursued at this point, but it's certainly something that, could see us sort of being a part of a suite of resources. Like Rob said, we're sort of in the midst of working with trying to figure out what resources would be most needed and how to really produce those.
Yeah, I mean, that really strikes me as in thinking about the kind of things we could share in a resource hub, like a template for, laying some sort of community expectations for a class discussion, or a statement of principles for a lab. That's maybe something that we could think about as a resource to highlight. And I'm not going to say here this is definitely something we're going to do, but it does strike me as that's the kind of resource that would be really helpful to kind of develop or get some input on and broadcast as a good practice.
And somebody else had a comment about, talking about evolution in terms that are not conflicting. bacteria, but not humans. Yeah, that's sometimes more palatable, except if you're dealing with people that are sort of on the borderline of young Earth creationism, and even then, which is not a huge population, but it is a good chunk of people. And even there, the question about the long evolution of bacteria, any sort of part of that conversation can be really hard, and that's one of the more challenging pieces to be to be a part of. But it's the way that we phrase the grant. By the time they're getting to apply to the grant, it's usually not a huge issue because we don't force them to bring it up. You know, we're not going in there saying we have to talk about these major issues. I mean, we go in there with Science Magazine and with sort of our credentials, and here's what we do, and here are our resources. But because we don't force them to talk about it, we're not trying to get them to this place to be able to have that conversation, because that actually ends up backfiring if we do that, because then they'll want to have big debates about intelligent design on campus or creationism versus evolutionism, which is definitely something we are not trying to do. We're not a big, we're not trying to fund big debates happening. We're just trying to fund good engagement with good science and connection to real local scientists. So, but that is certainly one of the many ways that if people want to engage with the evolution conversation, especially professors that want to engage with this for their students who may be really nervous, that is one of their ways of going about it.
I want to, so Caitlin highlighted something that I was about to mention, which is the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History Human Origins program has some really solid resources online on their website, and we can maybe put that in the Trellis group or something, or circulate them to them if there's a mailing list, including some that they're focused on human examples. And I think what the logic there, I hear the idea about focusing on maybe non-human examples as a way to sort of release some of the tension. But the counterpoint would be, human evolution is where the tension is, and so that's what we should be prepared to address. And they have some really robust and evidence-tested resources that suggest that these resources are effective in creating opportunities for people to discuss this without feeling attacked, or at least to kind of start them thinking about evolutionary theory in ways that are not quite so confrontational. So that I think I would want to echo Caitlin's suggestion that that's a really great set of resources. That they also have a really solid program that we were not involved in, but which I think is a wonderful model for what engagement looks like. And they have a traveling exhibit of the Smithsonian Human Origins Hall that has visited libraries around the country to sort of foster conversations around the question, what does it mean to be human? Which is a great question to have your framing around, because you don't have to be a scientist to have an opinion about that. And then this year, they've actually started visiting seminaries. So they're actually hosting a Hall of Human Origins exhibit with public discussions with scientists in seminary contexts. This is not our project, but we love it because it's very much in line with sort of the approaches that we believe the evidence suggests are effective.
We had one technical question with the AGU session.
Oh, so the AGU session, the deadline is technically today, but the sign-up link will remain active. We're not going to shut it down, and we're very happy to accept walk-ins if space permits. At this point, there's plenty of space, but sometimes we get a big surge of people, and there's only so many seats in the room. So, so if you think you can attend, I do encourage you to sign up. The sign-up link should not go away before the session.
And then Jeff had a really easy question for us. Where do you want to be in 20 years at Dozer? Well, great question.
So we're actually so this coming year is our 25th anniversary as a program. Although the early years of the program we were much more of a sort of much more of a philosophical white papery thing, and it was much more focused on evolution specifically.
The first 15 years, really.
Yeah. So the last, I'd say 8 years or 10 years under our current director, Dr. Jennifer Wiseman, who is in her day job is chief scientist for the Hubble, and then she runs our program as well. So she keeps her life full. It's really been much more about sort of public engagement with science in this particular lane.
Yeah.
I would like to see the kind of things we talk about more integrated into general public engagement practices. I think that a tension that we often have is there are some particular challenges that arise in talking about science for topics that do have some resonance with faith perspectives, or that maybe intersect with religious beliefs. But it's also true that it can be detrimental to kind of treat religion and faith as a separate track than culture or people, because this stuff doesn't necessarily exist in discrete tracks, right? So so I personally think that a real great thing would be over the next 20 years, the kind of things that our program talks about becomes more integrated into a broader public engagement discourse. So if that starts to happen, and I think that is starting to happen, that I think would be a great place. But
yeah, I think in terms of the direct sort of working with religious communities, I think it's a really interesting time, especially with the rise of sort of the nuns, as in people that are not affiliated with a certain religious institution, that which is also coinciding with really sort of hard times that are coming upon academia in general, as I'm sure everyone is aware of, which has especially hard effects on on the humanities. And a lot of these seminaries some of them are associated with institutions, and some of them are freestanding, and they're struggling as well. I mean, I think we want to keep working with a lot of the schools in the US and Canada. We're really hoping to continue to get grants for that. We've also been expressed a lot of need for overseas and other institutions around the world. And we have one initiative that we're hoping to start sometime next year in Europe, or at least in the UK. We've had some interest from parts of Africa, and so we're there's a lot of need for this type of work in terms of getting good science into seminary classrooms, and a lot of the need actually comes from the professors and the deans and administrators themselves. It says like, hey, we want this in our seminary. We want to be able to engage with culture in a really effective way, because this helps to train good pastors and good people for the future. So I think I just want to see that continue going. I think that's it's been a really positive experience for our program and for most of the seminaries involved. And so I can't speak for 20 years, but in 5 and 10, that's what we want to keep going at.
All right, I'll let you off the hook with that.
There you go.
Cool. So I think we will wrap it up there. That seems like a good note to end on. Thanks to Rob and John for hosting and leading this. This was awesome. I'm going to make a quick plug for our next SciEngage, which is on January 10th, and it will be led by our first repeat presenter, Jeannie Garbarino. So Jeannie, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. Hi.
Can you give like a 30-second spiel about what it'll be on?
Yeah, so essentially I'm conducting a study with my collaborator from Northwestern, Nikki Wojtowicz, and we are trying to really understand what the current landscape is when it comes to engagement, scientific engagement specifically out of academic or research institutions, that have like active science and scientific research programs. And our goals are to explore the perceived value of this engagement space and the perception of the professionals or volunteers who do it, to understand motivations and limitations to participate in these things, and also to examine the culture and climate of the science, like a science outreach or engagement as a distinct profession with a focus on gender and other types of demographics among the practitioners, with the hopes of being able to make some data-driven recommendations for how to support and sustain engagement efforts out of these institutions moving forward. So we'll be able to talk about that in a lot more detail in January.
Awesome. So thanks, Jeannie. Mark your calendars down. As always, we are always open for suggestions and ideas for different topics. So if you have a program that you want to talk about, or if you have an idea for something, please let us know. And finally, if you'd like to join our mailing list and you're not on it, just drop your email into the chat box and we will add you. All right. Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays. Hope everybody has a good New Year, and we'll see you in January.
Bye-bye.
Bye.